In the account of Jesus' last moments on earth, one episode stands out, deeply moving and full of spiritual meaning: his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. This moment has inspired countless believers, showing how Jesus, in his full humanity, faced the weight of sin and the suffering of the sacrifice he was about to make. However, in the middle of this story, there is a detail that has puzzled both theologians and scientists: the moment when the Son of God sweated drops of blood. What could have happened in Jesus' body for him to experience such an unusual phenomenon? How can someone sweat blood? What answers does modern science offer us in the face of such an extraordinary event? In this documentary, we will analyze how this event, in addition to having a possible medical explanation, has a profound spiritual meaning that exceeds the limits of our understanding. We will explore what happens to the human body under extreme stress and how this fact underscores the humanity of Jesus, who faced the weight of judgment that would bear the sins of all humanity. Before we continue, tell us, have you ever experienced a level of sadness so intense that it led you to agony? We would love to hear about your experience in this regard. Let's get started. The episode of Gethsemane, recounted in the Gospels, constitutes one of the most dramatic and emotional moments in the life of Jesus. According to the biblical accounts, after the Last Supper, Jesus retreated to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. Throughout his ministry, Jesus had demonstrated a total dependence on the Father through his constant prayer. But in Gethsemane, his prayer acquired an intensity that transcended ordinary prayers. The term Gethsemane comes from Aramaic and means oil press. The Garden of Gethsemane was located at the foot of the Mount of Olives, on the outskirts of Jerusalem. This mountain, which rises about 800 meters above sea level, is a place of great symbolism both in the life of Jesus and in Christian history. In the time of Jesus, it was a place known for its tranquility and proximity to the city, ideal for moments of meditation and prayer. In Gethsemane, it would be the preparation for what was to come: Calvary. In that place, Jesus faced such deep anguish that his sweat turned into drops of blood, which deserves a deep analysis from both a theological and medical point of view. Let's read the Bible passage to better understand this topic. It is found in Luke chapter 22, verses 39 to 44. And he came out and went, as he was wont, to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples also followed him. When he came to that place, he said to them, "Pray that ye enter not into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will but yours be done." And an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. The walk from the upper room to the Mount of Olives took at least 15 minutes. Jesus went there frequently to pray, and the disciples, including the traitor of course, knew it. When they arrived there, he warned them to pray, not to enter into temptation. Perhaps the particular temptation he had in mind was the pressure to abandon God and his Christ when enemies approached. Then Jesus left the disciples and went deeper into the garden, where he prayed alone. His prayer was that if the Father was willing, the cup might be taken from him. Nevertheless, not his will, but God's be done. Jesus knew clearly what the Father's will was, but he still experienced deep agony in his soul. His suffering did not arise from a lack of desire to fulfill God's will, but because he knew he was going to the cross as the sacrifice for the sins of mankind. He was not a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Unlike any other sacrificed animal, he did so with full knowledge of what it entailed. He decided voluntarily to give up his life. This helps us understand why Jesus used the image of the cup. In the Old Testament, the cup is a powerful figure of God's wrath and judgment, symbolizing the divine punishment that must be faced. In response to Jesus' prayer, the Father did not remove the cup from Jesus. Rather, he strengthened Jesus through an angelic messenger to be able to take and drink the cup. Now, the key verse that we are going to analyze in detail is verse 44. Let us notice what the biblical account says. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like unto great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Luke, a physician, recorded that Jesus' sweat was like drops of blood. Some consider Luke's description to be a simple comparison. Jesus' sweat fell to the ground in large, thick drops, like blood dripping from an open wound. However, there is a medical condition that produces the symptoms described and explains Luke's mention of blood. Luke tells us that Jesus was in agony. The Greek word describes a desperate struggle for life. There is no similar scene in all of history. It was the crucial moment in Jesus' life. He could still turn back and avoid the cross. The salvation of the world depended on that decision of Jesus as he sweated drops of blood in Gethsemane. From a theological perspective, Jesus' suffering in Gethsemane is interpreted as a manifestation of the spiritual weight of the mission he carried out. Theologians claim that Jesus, facing imminent betrayal, abandonment by his disciples, and crucifixion, experienced anguish that was not only physical, but deeply spiritual. This suffering is seen as part of his identification with humanity and his redemptive sacrifice. Theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his work Ethics, explains that in Gethsemane, Jesus faces the abyss of separation from God, an existential anguish that prefigures the cross. This suffering is a voluntary and conscious act on the part of Jesus, who accepts pain and death to fulfill his divine mission. Theologian Nicholas Thomas Wright also emphasizes that Jesus' agony in Gethsemane reflects his understanding of the sacrifice he had to make, not just as a physical act, but as a confrontation with the power of evil in the world. According to Wright, this anguish was not only emotional, but also a spiritual battle, where Jesus prepares to take upon himself the sins of the world. Now, we want to approach the subject of Jesus' agony from a medical point of view. We know that Luke the physician was the author of this gospel, and that, in his time, there was a certain understanding of the events described. However, for modern physicians, the bloody sweat mentioned in the Gospels as part of Jesus' suffering in Gethsemane has been the subject of study in various fields of medicine. This phenomenon, known as hematidrosis, occurs in extreme situations of stress, anxiety, or terror. Hematidrosis is a rare condition in which a person begins to sweat blood due to the rupture of capillaries near the sweat glands. This phenomenon is often related to extreme emotional or physical shock, which could explain Jesus' suffering at such a critical moment. This condition has been documented in the medical literature, although it occurs in exceptional cases. The blood vessels surrounding the sweat glands can burst due to the high internal pressure generated in situations of intense stress. Dr. Mark McDonald, a psychiatrist known for his work on the relationship between stress and health, has explained that extreme stress can induce a physiological response in the body, in which the small blood vessels surrounding the sweat glands are subjected to such high pressure that they burst. This causes blood to be released along with sweat, giving rise to the phenomenon known as hematidrosis. In Jesus' case, this type of extreme stress could have been brought on by the anticipation of impending torture and crucifixion, in addition to the emotional and spiritual burden he was experiencing at the time. Deep anguish and fear of future suffering may have triggered this intense physiological response. Dr. McDonald has documented cases of hematidrosis in people who have experienced profound psychological distress, such as the anticipation of disaster or emotional trauma, suggesting that the condition is related to extreme emotional shock. This medical explanation could shed light on the level of suffering that Jesus experienced in the Garden of Gethsemane when, according to the Gospels, he sweated blood in the midst of his agony. This phenomenon is a physical manifestation of emotional distress so intense that it affected the body in a visible and dramatic way, reflecting the deep tension and emotional pain that Jesus was experiencing at that crucial moment. Dr. Bruce McEwen, an expert in the study of stress and neuroscience, has pointed out that acute stress situations activate the autonomic nervous system, which regulates the involuntary functions of the body, including the release of stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. These hormones prepare the body for the fight or flight response, increasing blood pressure, heart rate, and tension in blood vessels. McEwen has documented how these effects can lead to overloading of small blood vessels, the capillaries, which can burst due to the high internal pressure. This, in turn, could explain the presence of blood in sweat, as occurs in the phenomenon known as hematidrosis. Applied to Jesus' agony, this medical explanation provides a possible understanding of the bloody sweat described in the Gospels during his suffering in Gethsemane. The anticipation of the extreme pain of crucifixion, coupled with the emotional terror and anguish of bearing the weight of the world's sin, may have intensely activated his autonomic nervous system. The release of stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol would have raised their blood pressure and internal tension, which could have caused the capillaries near the sweat glands to rupture, resulting in hematidrosis. This phenomenon not only reflects physical pain, but also an emotional and spiritual burden so deep that it affected her body in a visible way. The sweat of blood, in this context, becomes a physical manifestation of Jesus' extreme suffering, both in his body and in his soul, facing the torment that preceded his sacrifice on the cross. Now, hematidrosis has been reported in situations of extreme distress, although in very rare cases. An article published in the Journal of Clinical and Diagnostic Research mentions several cases in which patients experienced hematidrosis following situations of profound psychological stress, such as the loss of a loved one or extreme fear. The condition has also been reported in people facing impending traumatic events, which aligns with the anguish Jesus experienced when facing crucifixion. Severe emotional stress can trigger a series of physiological reactions in the human body. In situations of intense fear or distress, the body experiences a fight or flight response, a physiological reaction that prepares the organism to face an imminent threat. Dr. Charles Horace Mayo described how the autonomic nervous system responds to severe stress by increasing blood circulation and stimulating sweating to regulate body temperature. However, when stress is so intense and prolonged, as in the case of Jesus' agony, the response mechanisms can push the body beyond its normal capacity to adapt. In this regard, Dr. David Spiegel, professor of psychiatry at Stanford University, has argued that acute stress, especially when it involves anticipatory anxiety, can have extreme physiological effects, such as excessive sweating or, in rare cases, hematidrosis. Psychological stress is known to have a direct impact on the physiology of the human body. According to Dr. Michael Lee, an expert in emergency medicine, severe stress can cause a wide variety of physical reactions, including increased blood pressure, heart palpitations, and excessive sweating. In this context, the anticipation of physical trauma, such as crucifixion, together with the fear of suffering and betrayal, it could have had a direct impact on Jesus' blood circulation and sweat glands. Dr. Rachel Yehuda, an expert in trauma and post-traumatic stress, has documented how people facing intense stressful situations experience physiological alterations that can include symptoms such as excessive sweating, tremors, and in rare cases, phenomena such as hematidrosis. These symptoms may be even more pronounced in situations where the person perceives that his or her life is in grave danger, as in the case of Jesus, who anticipated imminent death and physical suffering. Now, from a cardiological point of view, this suggests that Jesus' blood pressure reached abnormally high levels due to extreme emotional and physical stress. This may have occurred due to the release of adrenaline and cortisol, which not only increase heart rate and blood pressure, but can also disrupt the integrity of smaller blood vessels. This rupture of the capillaries could have caused blood to leak into the sweat glands, resulting in bloody sweat. The combination of tachycardia, rapid heartbeat, hypertension, high blood pressure, and broken capillaries due to extreme emotional stress reflects how the physical and psychological stress at that time profoundly affected her cardiovascular system. From a cardiological point of view, emotions not only affect the nervous system, but also have a direct impact on the heart. Emotional pain, such as fear, anxiety, anticipatory guilt, and loneliness, are intense emotions that can cause an increase in the activity of the sympathetic nervous system. This causes rapid changes in heart rate and blood pressure, which can put significant strain on the heart. Thus, from a medical perspective, Jesus' agony in Gethsemane, and in particular the description of sweating drops of blood, can be explained by the phenomenon of hematidrosis, induced by extreme emotional and physical stress. Jesus' psychological anguish, anticipating crucifixion and bearing the weight of the world's sin, could have triggered these extreme physiological reactions. This medical analysis not only helps to understand Jesus' physical reactions during this crucial moment, but also the depth of agony he experienced. Although hematidrosis is extremely rare, it is a documented manifestation of the impact that psychological stress can have on the physiology of the human body in situations of extreme distress. We can say that in Gethsemane, a struggle took place that was not only spiritual, but also emotional, of profound and complex intensity. This moment in Jesus' life reflects an internal battle that involved both his soul and his spirit. On the one hand, he faced the temptation to reject the suffering that was coming to him, which provoked a whirlwind of intense emotions such as fear, anguish, and sadness. On the other hand, he experienced a deep connection with his divine mission and a total submission to the will of God, which implied the acceptance of the extreme sacrifice that was to come. The depth of this struggle in Gethsemane can be understood as a confrontation between the human desire to avoid pain and total obedience to a divine calling that involved suffering and sacrifice. Jesus, in his humanity, experienced the vulnerability of being emotionally affected, while at the same time remaining faithful to his spiritual purpose. This moment reflects not only a struggle of faith, but also an emotional experience that resonates with the complexity of the human being in the face of extreme situations. Yet, despite the intensity of this internal battle, Jesus emerged victorious. In his submission to God's will, he overcame fear, anguish, and temptation, and courageously faced the path of sacrifice that had been laid out for him. Thus, his victory in Gethsemane was not only a spiritual triumph, but also a lesson for all of us. As Christ emerged victorious at that crucial moment, we too can be more than conquerors through him, facing our own struggles with the confidence that in his strength and power, we can overcome any challenge that comes our way. This victory of Jesus gives us hope and the certainty that, in the midst of our spiritual and emotional battles, we can find the victory that Christ has already achieved for us. And so we come to the end of this video. We sincerely hope that the information shared has been useful and enriching for you, and that it has contributed something valuable to your understanding or interest in the subject matter discussed. We really appreciate your time and attention, and we would love to have you join us for the next video. See you soon. God bless you.